There are mysteries in the spirit that many people live under without ever discerning their source. One of the most dangerous among them is the mystery of unfinished altars, spiritual works that were started but never completed. These are altars whose sacrifices were laid but never consumed by fire, prayers that were ignited but never carried to the end, commitments that began with passion but were abandoned before fulfillment. In the realm of the spirit, incompletion is not neutral, it becomes a legal ground. What you start and do not finish becomes a doorway, a spiritual crack that allows the enemy to interfere with the journey God intended for you. Every altar carries a purpose, a process, and a fire. When that process stops midway, the altar remains open, half awakened, half activated, half fulfilled. Heaven recorded your intention, but the absence of completion prevents the release of the full manifestation. And as long as an altar remains incomplete, its fire remains. Silent fire becomes dormant power, and dormant power becomes delayed destiny. Many people carry promises that never matured, prayers that never birthed anything, and spiritual assignments that never reached their final stage. Not because God did not answer, but because the altar was left unfinished. Altars are dangerous because they create spiritual debts. Every time God stirs you to build, pray, sow, fast, commit, or obey, a spiritual transaction is initiated. But when the transaction is not completed, the altar becomes a reminder in the spirit, an open record of something that should have been sealed by fire. And when something remains unsealed, it remains vulnerable. This is why some people experience cycles of almost breakthrough, where the blessing comes close but never fully lands. Their altar is awake, but the fire is not. There are altars that were raised with tears but abandoned before joy arrived. Altars built with hunger for change, but never brought to completion because warfare intensified, distractions increased, or discouragement set in. These altars now stand in the spirit realm, like unfinished bridges, structures that were meant to carry you to the other side, but were never completed, leaving you suspended between what God promised and what you are living. And every time you attempt to rise again, the enemy uses that incomplete bridge to echo failure, fear, and frustration. Some unfinished altars were inherited. They are ancestral assignments that your fathers started but never fulfilled. Generational callings that were stirred but never embraced. Sacrifices that were meant to break old cycles but were abandoned before fire touched them. These become patterns. Family histories of starting strong but stopping suddenly. Destinies full of speed but empty of completion. And because altars don't disappear just because they were ignored, their incompletion continues to echo through the bloodline. There are people who pray but never finish the instruction. They fast but never close the assignment. They begin spiritual habits but never bring them to maturity. They start projects ordained by God but stop halfway when resistance rises. They ignite a new season but do not sustain it long enough for the divine fire to fall. And what they don't realize is this: in the realm of the spirit, the enemy doesn't fear what you start. He fears what you finish. He waits for your momentum to weaken, your consistency to drop, your fire to fade. Because as long as the altar remains unfinished, your breakthrough remains incomplete. Unfinished altars explain why many destinies experience the almost there syndrome. You get close enough to touch the blessing, but something pulls back. You reach the edge of manifestation, but something collapses. Opportunities open widely, then shut suddenly. Partnerships begin with promise, but dissolve before fruit appears. This is not coincidence. This is the spiritual tension created by incomplete altars. Heaven is ready to release, but the fire required to seal the transaction was never lit. Every divine altar requires fire, and fire only responds to completion. Elijah did not call fire on an unfinished altar. He rebuilt it fully before the fire descended. Abraham did not receive divine visitation until the sacrifice was placed in full alignment. Jesus did not redeem humanity halfway. He finished the work before the fire of resurrection arrived. Completion attracts fire. Incompletion delays manifestation. This is why unfinished altars become magnets for stagnation. The enemy understands this mystery more than many believers. This is why he fights your consistency more than your beginning. He doesn't mind you starting. He attacks your finishing.
He interrupts your discipline, weakens your momentum, distracts your focus, and pressures your spirit, so that the altar remains halfway, alive but powerless, open but inactive. Because he knows that once your altar reaches completion, fire will fall, chains will break, patterns will end, and destiny will shift. Tonight begins a divine reversal. Every unfinished altar in your life, every sacrifice that was laid but never consumed, every obedience that was started but not sealed, every spiritual assignment that was interrupted, shall receive completion by fire. Heaven is revisiting what you abandoned. The Spirit of God is breathing upon what you left halfway, awakening what you dropped, restoring what you paused, and empowering you to finish with fire. The altars of your destiny will not remain silent. Their fire shall speak again. There are moments in destiny when you can feel that something was supposed to continue, something was meant to move, something was destined to grow. But suddenly, everything freezes. You are flowing, advancing, rising, and then, without warning, the momentum dies. This is the mystery of midway interruption. It is not natural, and it is never accidental. Something in the spirit rises to choke your progress at the very point where fire was supposed to descend. Many people don't realize that the enemy does not fight the beginning of a journey. He fights the middle, because whoever controls the middle controls the outcome. When spiritual progress stops midway, it is a sign that a spiritual altar is being resisted. Progress in the spirit is like building an altar. Every step carries weight. Every action establishes ground. When you stop halfway, the structure still exists, but the fire that was meant to finalize the work never arrives. This is why you can pray and still feel stuck. You can fast and still feel suspended. You can obey and still feel you are not moving. Something interrupts the alignment between your obedience and heaven's release. And when that alignment breaks, progress stops. Not because you lack faith, not because you lack desire, but because something unseen is contesting your advancement. There is a spiritual pattern that many people fall into. They begin with passion, but they break in the middle. They start with conviction, but lose consistency. They launch with speed, but get weighed down before arrival. And these interruptions are not random. They are spiritual signatures. They indicate that you are fighting forces that specialize in breaking continuity. These forces are not after your beginning. They want to make sure your story never reaches completion. They want your testimony to remain almost, your victory to remain near, your story to remain unfinished. Because an unfinished story benefits the enemy more than a story never started. The enemy understands that the power of a testimony is not in the attempt, it is in the completion. So he releases distractions, delays, emotional attacks, physical exhaustion, financial pressure, relational tension, and spiritual heaviness at the very moment you are supposed to continue. He knows if he can weaken you midway, he can break the altar before fire comes. Every time you feel sudden discouragement right when you should be rising, every time a wave of heaviness hits you right when your consistency is about to stabilize, every time unexpected chaos erupts right when your prayer life starts gaining heat, something is fighting the completion of your altar. When progress stops midway, the spirit creates a void, a place where your soul becomes confused, your vision becomes blurred, and your strength becomes divided. You begin to wonder why you can sense the promise but cannot enter it, why you can feel the shift but cannot step into it, why you can see the future but cannot touch it. You feel suspended in a spiritual in-between, disconnected from what was behind you, but not yet connected to what is ahead. This is the warfare of unfinished altars, being spiritually positioned, but not spiritually completed. It is in these midway moments that many destinies collapse, because the enemy knows that if you stop long enough, your fire cools. If your fire cools, your altar weakens. And a weakened altar is an open invitation for spiritual interference. This is why some people experience this strange cycle. Every time they rise, warfare intensifies. Every time they build, storms arrive. Every time they align, distractions come. The enemy waits until you are halfway, then launches an attack strong enough to break the process before it matures. There are forces assigned to your journey that monitor your altitude. They don't interfere when you are still on the ground. They wait until you start ascending. They do nothing while you are planning, but they rise when you are progressing. They do not fight your imagination. They fight your manifestation. When they see your consistency forming, they strike. When they sense your altar strengthening, they resist. And when they perceive fire approaching, they attempt to silence it by stopping your progress before the final moment of completion. But what the enemy does not want you to know is that heaven watches your midway moments more closely than your beginnings. God is not only the author of your destiny, he is the finisher, and his greatest glory is revealed not when the altar is built, but when the fire falls. This means heaven is invested in your completion. Even when your momentum breaks, God does not abandon the process. Even when your strength fades, God does not cancel the assignment. Even when progress stops, heaven prepares fire for the moment you rise again. The beauty of divine restoration is this: God does not restart what you abandoned. He completes it. He does not erase the half-built altar. He perfects it. He does not throw away the incomplete sacrifice. He finishes it with fire. When spiritual progress stops midway, it may look like a setback, but in heaven's vocabulary, it is a pause before fire. It is the moment when God reviews your altar, reawakens your strength, and reignites your passion, so that when you continue, you do not continue in your own power. You continue in his fire. Midway interruption may have stopped you before, but tonight, God is declaring continuity over your destiny. Every area where your progress froze, every season where your strength died, every moment where your altar remained half alive, heaven is restoring it with divine fire. Your journey will not remain unfinished. Every sacrifice that stopped before its fire shall be completed tonight. There is a level of spiritual warfare that does not target your blessings, your finances, or even your relationships. It targets your fire, because the enemy knows that as long as your fire burns, your altar speaks. And as long as your altar speaks, your destiny moves. So he designs strategies not to stop you from lifting a sacrifice, but to stop the fire that should consume it. He waits for the moment when your obedience has been laid on the altar, when your spirit is finally aligned, when your hunger is rising, and that is when he steps in, not to destroy the altar, but to interrupt the fire. The enemy understands that fire represents completion. Fire seals what God begins. Fire finalizes what heaven authors. Fire is the spiritual signature that the altar is recognized in the realm of God. So when fire is interrupted, the altar remains open, the sacrifice remains pending, and the spiritual transaction remains incomplete. This is why many believers pray with sincerity but feel no breakthrough, fast with intensity but witness no shift, obey God deeply but see no manifestation. It is not the absence of sacrifice, it is the interruption of fire. Every major attack in the spirit is designed to cool something. If the enemy can cool your passion, your altar becomes silent. If he can cool your consistency, your altar becomes unstable. If he can cool your expectation, your altar becomes powerless. This is why sudden waves of discouragement hit people right before they enter a new dimension. This is why a strange heaviness comes when they try to pray. Why a fog descends when they try to think clearly. Why confusion rises when they attempt to obey God. It is not coincidence. It is targeted fire interruption. The enemy does not fear your worship. He fears the fire your worship attracts. He does not fear your prayers. He fears the fire your prayers release. He does not fear your sacrifices. He fears the completion that fire brings. Because once fire lands on an altar, something changes permanently. A chain breaks. A pattern collapses, a door opens, a destiny shifts, a covenant is established, a spiritual transaction is sealed. So his assignment is simple: weaken your fire before it gets strong enough to shift your atmosphere. The enemy's strategy of fire interruption often comes disguised as emotional warfare. Suddenly your heart feels tired, your spirit feels drained, your thoughts feel scattered. You start doubting what God said. You start questioning your own progress. You start feeling disconnected from your purpose. These emotional storms are not random, they are spiritual winds sent to extinguish your rising flame. Because once your fire reaches a certain level, nothing can stop what God has already ordained. Another strategy he uses is distraction, not sinful distraction, strategic distraction. Little things that steal your focus. Small issues that drain your time. Unnecessary conversations that drain your spirit. Unexpected conflicts that break your momentum. These are spiritual smokescreens, designed to pull you away from your divine altar at the exact moment fire should descend. The enemy does not need to destroy your faith if he can distract you long enough for your fire to cool. There are also seasons when the enemy uses exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion alone, but spiritual exhaustion, where your soul feels too tired to pray, too tired to fast, too tired to fight. A heavy cloud settles on your spirit, making everything feel difficult. This exhaustion is not natural. It is engineered. It is a satanic attempt to wear you down before your fire completes its work. Because an exhausted believer leaves the altar halfway, and an unfinished altar is an open opportunity for demonic interference. In some cases, the enemy sends confusion. Not massive confusion, but subtle, strategic confusion. You suddenly lose clarity, lose direction, lose spiritual sharpness. You begin second-guessing what you once knew with confidence. This confusion blocks the fire of discernment that should rise from your altar. When you cannot see clearly, you cannot ignite fully. And when you cannot ignite fully, the altar remains incomplete. But the most dangerous strategy the enemy uses is timing. He waits for the exact moment your fire is rising, when your spirit is aligning, when your consistency is strengthening, when your hunger is returning. He waits until you are on the edge of breakthrough, at the border of manifestation, at the doorway of completion. Then he strikes, because he knows that a believer who completes their altar is unstoppable. Once fire hits your sacrifice, the enemy loses his access point. He loses his influence. He loses his legal ground. Tonight, that cycle of interrupted fire breaks. Every force that has been cooling your fire, weakening your passion, scattering your focus, draining your strength, and interrupting your spiritual progress is being dismantled. Heaven is releasing a fire that the enemy cannot quench, a fire that completes what was started, a fire that seals your sacrifice, a fire that finishes your altar. The strategies of interruption end tonight. There are seasons when the patterns around you speak louder than your prayers, when the events in your life begin to reveal a hidden warfare you didn't know existed. And one of the most overlooked signs is the cycle of unfinished things, projects half completed, breakthroughs half manifested, promises half fulfilled. These are not normal delays. They are indicators that an altar in your life was awakened but never completed. When you begin to notice a trail of aborted processes in your destiny, it is a sign that unfinished altars are contending with your progress. One of the clearest signs is the almost there but never entering syndrome. You get close to opportunities, close to breakthroughs, close to open doors, but something collapses right before completion. The position is promised but never given. The contract reaches the final stage but falls apart. The relationship grows but breaks before commitment. The acceleration begins but stops before impact. This repeated nearness is not coincidence. It is a spiritual echo of an altar that was left without fire. Another sign is chronic inconsistency. You start spiritual disciplines with passion. Prayer, fasting, Bible reading, worship. But somewhere in the middle, the fire disappears. You begin business ideas with excitement but lose focus before profit. You start personal goals with determination but lose strength before results. This inconsistency is not laziness. It is spiritual interference. Something fights your finishing because something fears your completion. It is the fingerprint of an unfinished altar. There are also signs in your emotional realm, sudden waves of discouragement that hit you only when you are doing well, strange heaviness that appears only when you begin to rise, unexpected sadness that falls on you when you are close to finishing something important. These emotional attacks are not random. They are spiritual attempts to weaken the fire of your altar so that your sacrifice remains incomplete. When negative emotions rise right at the point of progress, a spiritual interruption is at work. Another sign is recurring stagnation. Progress begins, but then you find yourself stuck in the same place for months or even years. It feels like your destiny is on pause. You're waiting, praying, believing, but nothing moves. Every time you try to push forward, it feels like an invisible hand is pulling you back. This is not a simple delay. It is a spiritual hold caused by an altar that was never completed. Until that altar receives fire, your movement remains restricted. You may also notice cycles of unfinished dreams, plans that started with clarity but ended with confusion, visions that began with strength but melted into uncertainty, goals that once felt God-given but now feel unreachable, unrealistic, or forgotten. When your dreams keep dying in transition, it is a sign that your altar never reached the stage where fire gives birth to manifestation. Something interrupted your process before heaven could seal your future. Another major sign appears in relationships. Destiny connections start strong but fall apart without reason. Helpers arrive but disappear without explanation. People who were meant to support you suddenly withdraw. These relational collapses are not always natural. They are spiritual attacks designed to weaken the altar of your destiny. Because every altar God builds requires people. And the enemy knows if he can break people, he can interrupt your fire. Some signs manifest in finances. You earn but cannot keep. You save but cannot multiply. You invest but see no return. Money comes in but slips away with strange speed. Not because of mismanagement, but because unfinished altars create spiritual leaks. Resources needed to complete your destiny get swallowed by invisible forces, because the altar that it was supposed to secure those resources to completion. The most alarming sign is spiritual silence. When your prayers feel empty, your worship feels dry, your discernment feels dull, and your spirit feels distant from God. Yet you know something is supposed to shift. This silence is not abandonment. It is a sign that your altar is waiting for fire. Heaven is not ignoring you. Heaven is waiting for completion. Silence is a call to finish what you started. When these signs appear repeatedly, they are not warnings. They are confirmations that an altar in your life is unfinished. Confirmations that a sacrifice in your destiny remains unsealed. Confirmations that something in your spiritual journey was interrupted before fire could fall. But tonight, that pattern breaks. Tonight, every sign that has been pointing to unfinished altars is turning into evidence of divine completion. Every altar that waited for fire shall be completed by the hand of God. There is a dimension of power that heaven only releases when a sacrifice reaches completion. Not when it begins, not when it is halfway, not when the altar is built, but when the sacrifice is fully laid, fully offered, and fully carried to the moment when fire must come. Completion is the trigger that calls the fire of God. Completion is the sound that summons the supernatural. Completion is the seal that activates divine intervention. Every unfinished sacrifice remains a pending transaction in the realm of the Spirit. But every finished sacrifice becomes a doorway to unstoppable power. God has never responded to halfway obedience with full manifestation. He responds to the sacrifice that continues until the end. Abraham did not see divine provision until he lifted the knife. Elijah did not see fire until he rebuilt the altar completely. David did not receive angelic intervention until he paid the full price for the threshing floor. Jesus himself did not release salvation until he finished the work on the cross. Heaven honors the finisher. Heaven responds to the one who presses until the end. Heaven releases fire only when the sacrifice reaches its final moment of obedience. A completed sacrifice carries spiritual authority. It gives heaven legal right to interrupt demonic patterns, overturn satanic verdicts, and reverse ancestral limitations. Because when your sacrifice is completed, your altar becomes a voice. It begins to speak louder than generational curses, louder than demonic accusations, louder than the enemy's resistance. In the realm of the Spirit, a completed sacrifice becomes a witness, the testimony that your obedience reached the point where God must respond with fire. There are breakthroughs that do not come through prayer alone. They come through the power of completion. There are deliverances that do not manifest through prophecy alone. They manifest when your sacrifice reaches its finishing point. There are doors that remain closed not because God does not want them open, but because the altar that should open them has never reached completion. When your sacrifice is incomplete, your destiny remains waiting. But when your sacrifice is completed, heaven releases the fire that accelerates everything assigned to your name. A completed sacrifice carries the power to silence the enemy. This is why Satan fights completion so aggressively. Because the moment your sacrifice is completed, The moment your altar receives fire, the enemy loses his case. There is nothing more terrifying to the kingdom of darkness than a believer who finishes what God asks them to start. Because once you finish, your altar shifts from effort to evidence that God must honor, evidence that angels must obey, evidence that spiritual interference must bow to. When a sacrifice is completed, heaven releases speed. This is why you can struggle for years. But once you complete what God instructed, doors begin to open rapidly. Delays disappear. Stagnation breaks. Momentum increases. Divine helpers locate you without effort. What once resisted you begins to cooperate with you, because completion activates divine speed. Completion releases the wind of God behind your destiny. Completion turns your journey into a supernatural race where grace carries you farther than effort ever could. A completed sacrifice also carries the power of restoration. It pulls back what you lost. It resurrects what you abandoned. It revives what died in transition. When you complete what God instructed, He restores what the enemy stole during your season of incompletion. The years you lost become years regained. The strength you lost becomes strength renewed. The opportunities that died begin to reappear. Completion unlocks restoration. There is also a prophetic dimension to completed sacrifice. When your obedience reaches its final point, heaven releases a decree over your destiny. This decree becomes a spiritual seal, an irreversible announcement that your altar has been recognized, your sacrifice has been accepted, and your destiny has been authorized to advance. This is why completed sacrifice, it is not just an act, it is a spiritual announcement. When fire touches a finished altar, heaven declares that your next season has begun. A completed sacrifice changes your identity in the spirit. You are no longer marked as someone who almost made it, almost broke through, almost changed, or almost succeeded. You become marked as one who finishes, one who completes altars, seals assignments, fulfills divine instructions, and stands firm until fire falls. Finishing shifts your spiritual stature. Finishing elevates your authority. Finishing strengthens your influence in the unseen realm. You become a believer who cannot be intimidated because you are backed by an altar that is complete. And tonight, heaven is empowering you to finish. The strength you lost is returning. The fire you dropped is rising again. The discipline that slipped is being restored. Every unfinished altar in your life will receive fire. Every incomplete sacrifice will find its completion. Every divine instruction will be carried to the end. You are stepping into the realm of finishes. The realm where fire responds, angels move, heaven speaks, and destiny advances without interruption. There are altars that did not start with you, but still speak against you. There are spiritual assignments your fathers began, but never completed. Prayers they initiated, but never sealed. Commitments they made, but abandoned halfway. And because altars are spiritual structures, not emotional events, they do not dissolve with time. They continue speaking until fire completes them. This is why certain battles feel older than your own life. You are not just fighting your struggles. You are confronting altars left unfinished by generations before you. Generational altars become spiritual echoes, unfinished instructions that were never fulfilled, divine opportunities that were never embraced, spiritual callings that were never answered. When a generation begins something but never carries it to the point of divine fire, the next generation inherits not only their blessings, but also their incompletions. What they left unfinished becomes the warfare you are forced to confront. Their abandoned altars become your spiritual assignments. Some families carry patterns of sudden collapse, projects that prosper but die suddenly, businesses that rise but break unexpectedly, celebrations that turn into battles without warning. These patterns are signs of ancestral altars that were activated but never completed. When a sacrifice is laid, but not consumed by divine fire, its influence lingers in the bloodline. It creates cycles of almost success, almost breakthrough, almost deliverance. The previous generation started the altar, but the fire never came. Now the pattern continues until someone completes it. There are also families where spiritual callings were stirred but never matured. Someone was meant to be a prophetic voice, but resisted the assignment. Someone was meant to break a cycle, but compromised. Someone was meant to raise an altar of prayer, but gave up when warfare intensified. These incomplete callings create gaps, spiritual holes that the enemy exploits. And because heaven does not waste divine intentions, the calling hovers over the family, waiting for someone to complete what their predecessors abandoned. Unfinished altars also manifest through emotional patterns passed down generationally. Fear, hesitation, spiritual inconsistency, sudden discouragement, and the inability to finish anything become common traits in the lineage. These are not personality flaws. They are spiritual imprints. The fire that was meant to burn these patterns out never fell, because the altar was left halfway. Until a generation rises to complete the sacrifice, the emotional blueprint remains the same. Some families suffer from repeated delays. Marriages delayed, promotions delayed, breakthroughs delayed, stability delayed. The delay is not natural, it is inherited. An altar was raised long ago. An altar meant to break delay, but it was never completed. Fire never came. And where there is no fire, there is no release. So the delay travels through bloodlines like a shadow, hovering over every generation until someone rises to finish what was started. There are also families with a history of untimely setbacks. Every time someone rises, something pulls them down. Every time a family member approaches success, a strange misfortune appears. This is the warfare of unfinished altars. The sacrifice was raised to break the curse. But because fire was never released, the curse remained active. The altar is not dead, it is unfulfilled. And an unfulfilled altar keeps the battle alive through the generations that follow. Unfinished altars can even influence spiritual behaviors. Families may show sudden spiritual hunger but lose momentum quickly. They may rise in prayer for a season, but fall back into silence before breakthrough. This inconsistency is a spiritual inheritance, an echo of the inconsistency of those who came before. When ancestors started altars but never carried them to completion, the pattern of incompletion becomes a generational signature until divine fire breaks the cycle. But the most powerful truth is this: God never leaves a generational altar unfinished. He always raises someone, a chosen vessel, a spiritual repairer, a destiny carrier, to complete the sacrifice that previous generations could not finish. You may be that person. You may be the one heaven appointed to bring fire to the altars your family abandoned. You may be the one chosen to silence generational stagnation, to complete ancestral assignments, to break inherited cycles, and to finish the spiritual journey your fathers began. And tonight, heaven is empowering you to be the finisher of your bloodline. The fire that did not fall in past generations will fall in yours. The battles they could not win, you will conquer. The cycles they could not break, you will destroy. The destiny they could not complete, you will fulfill. You are rising, not just for yourself, but for every voice in your lineage that started something but never saw its completion. You will finish with fire where others stopped in defeat. There is a spirit that walks through families, generations, and destinies. An ancient force that rises every time a person is about to complete something God ordained. It waits quietly when you start, but it awakens violently when you approach the finish. This is the spirit of incompletion. It is a sabotaging force that interrupts divine progress, breaks spiritual momentum, and scatters your strength right at the point of breakthrough. It does not care about your beginning. Its mission is to bury your finishing. And until this spirit is confronted and broken, every altar you build remains vulnerable to unfinished endings. The spirit of incompletion does not attack your desire. It attacks your discipline. It does not attack your vision. It attacks your consistency. It does not attack your prayer life when you start praying. It attacks when your prayer begins to produce fire. It fights not your passion, but your persistence. Because the enemy knows you don't need strength to begin. Anyone can begin. You need supernatural strength to finish. The spirit of incompletion drains that strength, leaving you spiritually dehydrated when your altar needs your full obedience. This spirit operates subtly. It enters through delays, discouragement, emotional instability, sudden distractions, unexpected burdens, and unexplained heaviness. You begin with clarity, but confusion rises midway. You start with fire, but coldness creeps in as you advance. You move with momentum, but resistance intensifies the closer you get to completion. It is a spiritual warfare pattern that aims to convince you that finishing is impossible, unnecessary, or too costly. But the truth is, the cost of incompletion is far more expensive than the cost of finishing. The spirit of incompletion often works with the spirit of slowness, delaying your progress until your faith weakens, your focus breaks, and your fire cools. It replaces divine urgency with spiritual fatigue. It turns simple tasks into overwhelming burdens. It magnifies small obstacles into giant walls. Its goal is to make you abandon what God instructed you to carry to completion. This is why many believers feel spiritually tired for no reason when they are about to finish something significant. The battle is not physical, it is spiritual. Another weapon this spirit uses is emotional turbulence. It hits you with sudden sadness, strange discouragement, or unexplained emptiness at the exact moment you're supposed to rise. You begin questioning yourself, your ability, your progress, your worth, your calling. This emotional fog is not natural. It is designed to suffocate your fire, because the enemy knows that once your emotions break, your altar loses heat, and a cold altar invites incompletion. This spirit also brings strategic distractions, opportunities that are not from God, conversations that drain your spirit, minor problems that consume your time, sudden crises that derail your focus. These distractions do not appear at the beginning. They appear at the finishing stage, because the enemy wants to scatter your attention before the fire falls. He knows that if he can pull you away from your altar for just a moment, the entire process can collapse. The spirit of incompletion also attempts to isolate you. It pushes away destiny helpers, breaks divine connections, and creates unnecessary misunderstandings. It knows that finishing often requires people, encouragement, partnership, agreement, support. So it creates fractures at the exact moment you need unity. This isolation is a spiritual trap meant to convince you that finishing is impossible without strength you do not have. But heaven is your strength. God is your finisher. And tonight, isolation will not steal your fire. Breaking this spirit requires a decision in the soul, a refusal to bow to discouragement, a rejection of spiritual fatigue, a holy stubbornness that refuses to stop until the altar is complete. It requires rising even when your emotions tremble. It requires praying even when your mind is tired. It requires obeying even when your strength is low, because the spirit of incompletion loses its power when you refuse to stop. It collapses when you push even one more step beyond its resistance. But the real power comes from heaven's intervention. When God breathes on you, the strength to finish rises. When God empowers you, the fire returns. When God restores you, the altars you abandoned awaken again. Tonight, the Spirit of the Lord is breaking the power of incompletion over your life. Every force that fought your finishing, every altar that resisted your completion, every cycle that kept you in half-fulfilled destinies is losing its grip. The fire of completion is falling. You are rising with a finisher's anointing. The strength to complete what you started is returning. The fire to carry your altars to fire is being restored. The discipline that was stolen is being revived. Every assignment you dropped will find resurrection. Every calling you paused will reignite. Every altar you abandoned will receive divine completion. Tonight, the spirit of incompletion breaks forever, and your destiny steps into the power of finishing by fire. There comes a moment in every destiny when God calls you back to the altars you abandoned, not to shame you, not to punish you, but to complete what was left hanging. Because unfinished altars do not disappear. They wait for the day your spirit becomes mature enough, strong enough, awakened enough to finish what you could not finish before. These altars stand like silent monuments in the spirit, reminding heaven of what was started, reminding hell of what never got completed, and reminding your destiny of what still needs to burn. When God brings you back to a half-built altar, it is a sign that restoration is beginning. Rebuilding an unfinished altar is not a return to failure. It is a return to destiny. It is heaven showing you that what you abandoned was never rejected. What you paused was never canceled. What you dropped was never erased. God does not forget altars. He does not archive sacrifices. He does not discard divine instructions. What you stopped is still waiting for your return. Rebuilding is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of spiritual maturity. It is the moment when you finally pick up what your spirit was too weary to carry before. When you return to a half-built altar, you will often discover that the enemy tried to cover it with disappointment, discouragement, or shame. He tried to convince you that too much time has passed, too much damage has been done, too much momentum has been lost. But the truth is this: time does not weaken a divine altar. Delay does not cancel its purpose, and shame cannot erase its assignment. What God instructed you to build still carries the same fire, the same power, the same destiny. And when you return to it, heaven honors your obedience, as if no time was lost. Rebuilding requires spiritual honesty. You must acknowledge where you stopped, why you stopped, and what caused the interruption. You must confront the emotional wounds, the spiritual fatigue, the unexpected warfare that caused you to abandon your altar. Because rebuilding is not about pretending nothing broke. It is about gathering the fragments and restoring what was damaged. And in this restoration, God does not expect perfection. He expects surrender. He expects a heart that says, "Lord, I am ready to finish." There is a sacred moment in rebuilding when heaven aligns itself with your hands. Every stone you lift is strengthened by grace. Every step you take is supported by angels. Every prayer you raise is amplified by divine presence. Because rebuilding is a co-laboring moment. Your obedience meets God's power. Your effort meets God's fire. Your healing meets God's restoration. When you rebuild an altar with a surrendered heart, heaven partners with you until the fire falls. Rebuilding also means restoring the consistency that was once broken. It means praying again, even if your voice shakes. It means fasting again, even if your strength is low. It means worshiping again, even if your spirit feels dry. It means obeying again, even when your emotions are uncertain. Consistency is the oxygen of a rebuilding altar, and every act of obedience becomes a new stone placed on what once stood unfinished. The more you persist, the more the altar takes shape again. When you rebuild, you must remove the rubble, the emotional debris, the mental exhaustion, the spiritual clutter left behind by the interruption. You must clear away the bitterness, the disappointment, the self-doubt, the guilt, the fear of failing again. Because an altar cannot be rebuilt on top of previous frustration. The foundation must be cleared, healed, and restored. Only then can new fire rest on old purpose. But rebuilding does not only restore you, it restores your lineage. Every altar you complete breaks a generational pattern of incompletion. Every sacrifice you finish silences ancestral failures. Every divine assignment you complete activates blessings that were delayed for decades. When you rebuild, you are not just restoring what was lost. You are opening doors your family never walked through. You are finishing battles your ancestors could not finish. You are completing destinies that your bloodline never saw. Most importantly, rebuilding brings fire. The fire that once seemed distant returns with intensity. The passion that died begins to burn again. The clarity that you lost begins to shine again. The spiritual authority that faded begins to rise again. When an altar is rebuilt, heaven recognizes the structure, acknowledges the sacrifice, and responds with divine fire. This fire does not merely complete the altar, it revives the builder. It empowers the finisher. It ignites destiny. Tonight, you are returning to every altar you left hanging. You are picking up what you dropped. You are rebuilding what you abandoned. You are restoring what was broken. Heaven is strengthening your hands. Angels are assisting your steps. Fire is waiting at the top of your obedience. And the altars that once stood silent will roar again with divine completion. There comes a point in every spiritual journey where human effort can no longer carry the assignment. You can build the altar, you can lay the stones, you can place the sacrifice, but only God can supply the fire. It is this divine fire that finalizes, seals, and completes what you began. Without fire, the altar remains a structure. With fire, it becomes a spiritual transaction. When heaven releases fire, the process that felt stagnant comes alive. What was delayed begins to accelerate. What was resisted begins to surrender. Fire is the divine signature that the work has reached its completion. Fire is not symbolic. It is spiritual reality. Fire is heaven's yes. Fire is God's confirmation. Fire is the response that turns your obedience into breakthrough. It is fire that breaks the yoke of incompletion. It is fire that silences demonic interference. It is fire that consumes every residue of delay. When God releases fire, Everything that hindered your finishing loses its power instantly. The enemy fights your fire because he knows once God ignites your altar, nothing in the spirit can stop what has been authorized to manifest. This fire comes when your altar reaches the point of divine readiness. It comes when your surrender becomes complete, when your obedience becomes full, when your spirit stands aligned. Fire does not fall on scattered stones. It falls on altars prepared with intention. When heaven sees that your sacrifice has reached its appointed moment, the fire descends with precision. It does not come early nor late. It comes at the exact moment when its impact will change everything. When divine fire arrives, it does not negotiate. It consumes every barrier, every spiritual debris, every demonic resistance. It consumes fear, doubt, and hesitation. It consumes the feeling of failure that kept you paralyzed. It consumes the emotional wounds that drained your strength. Fire purifies, transforms, and empowers. It cleanses what was polluted. It sanctifies what was compromised. It perfects what was unfinished. When fire touches your altar, you are no longer fighting with your strength. Heaven is fighting for you. This is why the enemy fears your rising. He fears you reaching the point where fire is inevitable. He fears you praying until breakthrough becomes unavoidable. He fears you obeying until divine response becomes mandatory. He fears you standing at the same altar he interrupted years ago, this time with maturity, clarity, and spiritual authority. Because when you stand in that place again, you are no longer the weak version of yourself that abandoned the process. You are the refined version, the rebuilt version, the resurrected version. When fire falls, unfinished assignments suddenly gain acceleration. Things that took years begin to complete themselves. Relationships realign. Finances stabilize. Doors open without resistance. Divine helpers appear without effort. Your spirit senses a wind that was not there before. Your environment shifts. Your atmosphere changes. Fire does not just complete altars. It catapults destinies. What seemed impossible suddenly becomes inevitable. Fire releases divine speed. This fire also awakens dormant gifts. Talents you thought were lost begin to return. Passions you thought were gone begin to rise. Visions you abandoned begin to breathe again. Fire revives the dead areas of your calling. It resurrects what incompletion buried. It ignites what discouragement silenced. When fire comes, everything inside you begins to function at heaven's frequency again. The fire of completion also births confidence. Not human confidence, but spiritual assurance. You stop questioning whether God is with you. You stop doubting your calling. You stop fearing failure. Fire gives you inner conviction, the certainty that what was started will be finished. You begin to walk with a different posture, speak with a different tone, pray with a different authority, because fire replaces hesitation with boldness. And when fire falls, your destiny becomes sealed. No demon can reopen what God closes. No curse can resist what God consumes. No delay can withstand what God ignites. Fire marks the end of the old season and the beginning of the new. Once fire has touched your altar, the unfinished becomes finished, the pending becomes completed, the delayed becomes accelerated, and the silent becomes activated. Fire finalizes everything heaven intended for you. Tonight, the fire to finish is coming upon your life. The fire to complete your assignments, the fire to restore your altars, the fire to break cycles of incompletion, the fire to carry your destiny to its fulfillment, the fire that brings closure, restoration, acceleration, and manifestation. Heaven is releasing the fire that the enemy feared the most, the fire that completes what you began, ignites what you dropped, and seals what God ordained. You will finish by fire. There comes a moment when words stop being mere sounds and begin to function as weapons, spiritual instruments that establish new seasons and dismantle old patterns. Prophetic declarations are not motivational quotes. They are legal decrees in the realm of the Spirit. They carry the weight of divine authority and the breath of God's intention. And tonight, heaven is releasing declarations that will complete every unfinished altar, seal every pending sacrifice, and restore every assignment the enemy tried to interrupt. These declarations will not float, they will land. They will not echo, they will establish. I decree that every altar in your life that stood halfway, every prayer assignment you abandoned, every spiritual discipline you dropped, every obedience you paused, receives divine breath now. Let the wind of the Spirit locate every place where you stopped and revive it with supernatural life. What was dormant rises. What was stagnant moves. What was silent speaks. What was unfinished awakens. There shall be no dead altars in your destiny. I decree that the spirit of incompletion breaks permanently. Every demonic force that fought your consistency, drained your passion, scattered your focus, or weakened your fire loses its authority over you tonight. The shield of divine finishing surrounds your destiny. The mantle of completion rests upon your shoulders. Where you once stopped, you shall now continue. Where you once hesitated, you shall now finish. Where you once trembled, you shall now walk with boldness. I decree that every ancestral altar that was started but never completed, every generational assignment that was abandoned, every spiritual calling that was resisted, every purpose that was delayed, comes under divine fire now. You are rising as the finisher of your bloodline. You will complete what others could not. You will finish what others feared. You will carry to the end what others dropped in the middle. Your name becomes a landmark of generational completion. I decree that every area of your life where you experienced almost becomes finally. Almost healed becomes fully healed. Almost blessed becomes fully blessed. Almost free becomes completely delivered. Almost stable becomes permanently established. Almost successful becomes undeniably triumphant. The cycle of near success without manifestation is destroyed. Your altar shall not produce almost. Your altar shall produce completion. I decree that divine fire falls upon every sacrifice you have made. Your prayers, your fasting, your giving, your obedience, your tears, your sacrifices of faith. None of them are wasted. None are forgotten. None are ignored. Fire shall locate every effort that seemed unrewarded. Fire shall complete every spiritual transaction. Fire shall seal every act of obedience. What you did in secret will produce results in the open. I decree that restoration flows like a river into every area that incompletion damaged. Years that were lost return with interest. Strength that was drained is renewed. Opportunities that died are resurrected. Relationships that were broken are healed. Visions that were abandoned are revived. Restoration is not coming slowly. It is arriving with speed, accuracy, and divine power. What you lost because you stopped is returning because you are rising. I decree that divine helpers appear in your journey. People assigned by heaven to assist your finishing. Strengthen your hands, encourage your spirit, and partner with your destiny. I declare that wrong people will exit suddenly and right people will appear effortlessly. Your environment will align with your completion. No relationship connected to your finishing shall be hindered. I decree that clarity returns to your spirit. No more confusion. No more fog. No more double-mindedness. No more spiritual paralysis. Heaven sharpens your discernment. Heaven strengthens your focus. Heaven restores your spiritual vision. You will know what to finish, how to finish, and when to finish. You will move with clarity, precision, and spiritual confidence. I decree that the fire of the finisher rests upon your life. A fire that burns laziness, breaks delay, destroys distraction, silences fear, and releases supernatural discipline. You are stepping into the realm of unstoppable completion. Everything God authored in your life, you shall finish. Every altar God instructed you to build, you shall bring to fire. Every destiny God wrote about you, you shall fulfill. Tonight I decree that your season of unfinished stories ends forever. Every sacrifice that stopped before its fire shall be completed now. Every altar that waited in silence shall roar with divine flames. Every part of your destiny that hung in suspension shall drop into manifestation. Heaven has spoken. Fire has fallen. Your altar is complete, and your destiny is rising into its full, unstoppable, God-ordained completion. There are moments when heaven closes a chapter not with silence, but with fire, when God himself steps into the shadowed places of your destiny and declares that what once remained unfinished will remain unfinished no more. As you reach the end of this journey, understand this: you have not merely read words. You have crossed into a spiritual threshold. The altars that once stood dormant, silent, abandoned, and half-built have been awakened. The sacrifices that lacked fire now carry the marks of divine completion. What once weakened you has been burned away. What once delayed you has been overturned. What once resisted you has bowed to the fire of God. This is not the end of the message. It is the beginning of movement. A shift has taken place in the unseen realm. The atmosphere around your destiny has changed. Where you once felt stuck, you will now feel momentum. Where you once experienced interruption, you will now experience acceleration. What you began in weakness, you shall finish in power. The mantle of incompletion that hovered over your life has been torn. The patterns that chained your progress have been broken. The fire that fell on your altar tonight is not momentary. It is permanent. It will follow you, empower you, carry you, and keep you until every assignment God placed in your hands reaches its appointed end. Walk now with the confidence of one whose altar has spoken. Move now with the authority of one whom heaven has freshly anointed. Rise now with the assurance that nothing the enemy used to stop you will ever succeed again. You are stepping into a season where your efforts will bear fruit, where your obedience will release manifestation, where your persistence will produce results. Every part of your destiny that once trembled under the weight of incompletion is standing strong under the fire of God. You are not who you used to be. You are a finisher, a carrier of divine fire, a steward of completed altars. As you leave this message, do not leave the fire behind. Carry it into your decisions, your prayers, your relationships, your calling, your tomorrow. Let this fire refine your discipline, sharpen your vision, and strengthen your spirit. Let it remind you that you are not walking alone. Heaven walks with you. Angels surround you. Favor goes before you. Grace sustains you. And the God who started this work in you will not rest until everything concerning your destiny is fulfilled. You rise from this moment, unstoppable. Welcome to your season of completion. Welcome to your season of restoration. Welcome to the realm where altars speak and fire answers. Your story will not end halfway. Your destiny will not remain suspended. Your assignment will not die in transition. You will finish every chapter God wrote for you, and you will finish it by fire. This is your everlasting solution, where unfinished altars meet the God who completes all things.